There is a moment, right before the first bite, when a European face does something very specific. The eyes narrow, the fork hesitates, and a private verdict is already forming. This cannot possibly be food. Peanut butter glistening like wet clay, a casserole buried under melted marshmallow, a soda that smells unmistakably of cough syrup. These are not obscure dishes. They are staples, foods most Americans eat without a second thought. But to a visitor seeing them for the first time, they don't look like dinner. They look like a dare. So the first bite gets taken out of politeness, not appetite. The small, resigned courtesy of a guest getting an unpleasant task over with, which is what makes what happens next so hard to explain later. The fork goes down slower than it went up. Confusion turns into curiosity, and curiosity, against every prediction, turns into wanting more, because these 7 foods were never actually random. Each one was built deliberately to solve a real problem. A farmer stretching $1, a pharmacist selling sobriety instead of whiskey, an army trying to feed soldiers without refrigeration. The strangeness was never the point. It was a side effect of the solution. What follows are those 7 foods, dismissed on sight and defended by the same people minutes later. 7 times a European decided, out loud or in silence, I was wrong about this. And once that realization lands, it rarely reverses. The fork keeps going back for more, long after the skepticism has quietly left the table.
That's actually pretty good. It's definitely not something that I want to eat at breakfast time, but it's salty, creamy, doesn't taste like hot milk, which I've tried to make this gravy at home a couple times and it just tastes like hot milk. Okay. Yes, I'll eat it, but no, not for breakfast. Can we compromise on that? Let's see what John...
Biscuits and gravy. This is not what we call gravy in the UK. This is very different. I've also got this. Grits, it's called, I don't know. This has been years in the making. Me talking about this, reacting to it, and now I'm here. And of course, I have the southern sweet tea. So, we call this bread in the UK. I'm annoyed that I like that. It's got like that slight bit of spice to it. Mwah! Let's try grits. I was also told to put butter. How do I... Right. Butter in la grits. There you go. This looks... It's like porridge. Wow. Okay, I like biscuits and gravy, and I like grits, and I like southern sweet tea. I am basically from the south of America. Yeehaw!
What does a European visitor actually see when they open an American refrigerator and find a jar of peanut butter sitting beside the jam, thick and matte and the color of wet sand? To most of Europe, peanuts belong in a bowl at a bar, salted, crunched between sips of beer, never spread across bread and eaten by the spoonful, never packed into a child's lunch 5 days a week for a decade of childhood. The texture alone unsettles. Not quite solid, not quite liquid, clinging to the roof of the mouth in a way that feels less like food and more like an obstacle. So the question forms almost immediately. Why would an entire country build a national comfort food around something this strange to swallow? The answer has nothing to do with taste and everything to do with cotton. By the early 1900s, the American South had built its entire economy on a single crop, and the boll weevil, a small, relentless beetle, was tearing through it field by field, county by county, leaving farmers with soil that could no longer support the one thing they knew how to grow. Into that crisis stepped George Washington Carver, an agricultural scientist at Tuskegee Institute, who did not simply suggest that farmers diversify. He handed them a replacement crop, already proven to restore nitrogen to exhausted soil, the peanut, and then spent years engineering uses for it so that farmers would actually have somewhere to sell what they grew. Carver did not invent peanut butter, but he did something more consequential. He turned the peanut from a curiosity into a commodity, cataloging over 300 uses for it until the crop had enough commercial demand to justify planting it at scale. That alone might have made peanut butter a regional footnote, a southern ingredient tied to a southern crisis. What turned it into a national fixture was a second, entirely separate piece of federal machinery: the school lunch program. When the United States began feeding millions of children through subsidized public school meals in the mid-20th century, the criteria were blunt and unsentimental. The food had to be cheap, shelf-stable, high in protein, and resistant to spoilage in a kitchen with no guarantee of refrigeration. Peanut butter satisfied every requirement simultaneously, and in a way few other foods could. It didn't need to be cooked. It didn't need to be cold. A single jar could feed a classroom for a week. And so, quietly, without any campaign asking children to love it, peanut butter became load-bearing infrastructure in the American diet. Spread across bread in millions of kitchens, not because a chef invented a craving, but because a government program needed a protein that could survive a Tuesday afternoon in an unrefrigerated cafeteria in July. This is the detail that tends to catch a visitor off guard mid-bite. The sandwich in front of them was never really a culinary invention at all. It was an agricultural rescue plan and a logistics solution, laminated together and handed to a child in a paper bag. The sticky, strange texture that seemed like a flaw at first taste is, in fact, the entire reason the food survived. A peanut butter sandwich left in a locker all morning is exactly as edible at noon as it was at 8 a.m. A property almost no fresh food can claim. What reads as primitive on the tongue is structurally a triumph of shelf stability, and that is usually the moment something shifts, not because the taste itself has changed, but because the food no longer looks accidental. It looks engineered. A visitor who spent the first bite wondering how anyone could enjoy this finds themselves, by the third bite, unable to stop reaching for more, not quite sure when suspicion turned into appetite, only aware that it did. But if a beetle and a school lunch could turn peanuts into a national staple, what does it take to turn a bottle of soda into a symbol of an entire country's war against alcohol? The first sip is almost always the same. A European visitor expecting something in the neighborhood of cola takes a mouthful of root beer and stops. Not from disgust exactly, but from confusion. It tastes like wintergreen and sassafras, and something faintly medicinal, closer to a cough drop dissolved in carbonated water than to any soda they've had before. The instinctive reaction is to check the label, as if the bottle has been mislabeled, because nothing about the flavor says refreshment. It says remedy, and that instinct, it turns out, is not wrong. It's just about a century out of date. Root beer was never designed to taste like a treat. It was designed to taste like medicine, because that is precisely what it was sold as. In the second half of the 19th century, the American drugstore was not the aisle of painkillers and shampoo it is today. It was a social hub built around the soda fountain, a marble and brass counter where a pharmacist mixed carbonated water with tinctures, syrups, and extracts of roots and barks believed to have tonic properties. Sassafras, sarsaparilla, wintergreen, licorice. These weren't flavor choices in the way a modern beverage company selects flavors. They were pulled directly from the pharmacist's own dispensary, the same shelf that held cough remedies and digestive tonics, because the soda fountain and the pharmacy counter were, quite literally, the same piece of furniture. What turned this drugstore tonic into a household name was not thirst, but temperance. As the American temperance movement gathered political force through the late 1800s, eventually culminating in nationwide prohibition in 1920, pharmacists and beverage makers found themselves with an enormous commercial opportunity, a nation full of men who had spent their evenings in saloons and now needed somewhere else to go and something else to drink. Root beer, along with its fountain cousins, was marketed explicitly as the respectable alternative to whiskey, a drink a man could order at a counter in full view of his neighbors, his pastor, his wife, without a hint of scandal attached to it. Charles Hyers, who commercialized one of the first mass-market root beers in the 1870s, pitched it directly at temperance audiences, at one point even suggesting it be called root tea, so as not to alarm the very drinkers he was trying to convert. The name root beer survived, but the marketing logic behind it, sobriety, dressed up as flavor, never really left the recipe. This is why the taste refuses to resemble anything else on the shelf. Cola, orange soda, ginger ale, nearly every other major American soft drink evolved toward sweetness, toward mass appeal, toward flavors built to be liked instantly. Root beer alone kept its medicinal backbone intact, because for most of its commercial life, tasting like medicine wasn't a design flaw to engineer away. It was the entire point. A drink that tasted like a treat couldn't credibly stand in for whiskey at a soda counter. It had to taste like something with a little gravity to it, bitter enough at the edges to feel like a real substitute for something a man was giving up, not just a sugary distraction from it. Once a visitor understands this, the second sip almost always changes. What tasted like an odd, vaguely herbal soda a moment ago now tastes like a fossil. A drink that carries, unaltered, the actual chemical signature of a 19th century pharmacy counter, and a nationwide argument about drinking that most Americans have long forgotten was ever fought. It is not a beverage that was invented to be loved on contact. It's one that was built to be trusted at a moment when trust around what a person put in their glass mattered more than it ever had before. But temperance explains why root beer tastes strange. It doesn't explain why, a few states over and several decades earlier, poor Southern farmers were pouring gravy over bread and calling it breakfast, a habit with a log. Set a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of a European visitor and watch the confusion arrive in stages. First, the biscuit itself. Not sweet, not the tea time cookie the word implies back home, but a dense, savory wedge of dough. Then the gravy, poured over the top like a sauce over dessert. A thick, peppery, off-white substance with no clear vegetable, no visible protein, nothing that announces what it's actually made of. It looks to unfamiliar eyes like a kitchen accident. Bread drowned in something that should have gone somewhere else. And the question that follows is almost always the same. Why would breakfast look like this? The answer is that it wasn't designed to look like anything. It was designed to survive on almost nothing because it was built for people who had almost nothing to spend. In the decades following the Civil War, much of the rural American South entered a long period of grinding poverty, worked disproportionately by tenant farmers and sharecroppers, men and women who farmed land they didn't own, in exchange for a cut of the crop that rarely covered what they owed the landowner for seed, tools, and rent. Cash was scarce, refrigeration was non-existent, and the food available to stretch through a working day in the fields had to meet one brutal criterion above all others: maximum caloric density for minimum cost. Flour, lard, and buttermilk met that criterion better than almost anything else available to a southern tenant farmer. Flour was cheap and shelf-stable. Lard, rendered pig fat, was a byproduct of hog slaughter that would otherwise go to waste, and it packed more usable calories per ounce than nearly any other ingredient in the pantry. Buttermilk, the leftover liquid from churning butter, was often free, a byproduct rather than a purchase. Combined and baked, they produced the biscuit, a bread that required no yeast, no long rise, no oven precision, and could be made fresh each morning from ingredients already sitting in the kitchen. The gravy poured over it followed the identical logic. Flour and lard, thinned with milk or the drippings left in the pan after cooking whatever scrap of pork was available. Seasoned aggressively with black pepper because pepper was one of the only ways to make a meal of fat and flour taste like more than fat and flour. Nothing in the dish was chosen for flavor first. Everything was chosen because it kept a body working through 12 hours in a cotton field on the smallest possible grocery bill. This is the detail that tends to land hardest with a visitor mid-forkful. Biscuits and gravy is not a recipe in the way a French sauce or an Italian pasta is a recipe, refined over generations towards some ideal of taste. It's closer to a caloric equation, solved under duress, that happened to also be edible. The thick, unapologetic richness that first read as excess, too much fat, too much starch, nothing green in sight, is in fact the entire design brief. A farmer eating this at 5 in the morning wasn't looking for balance. He was looking for enough fuel to survive until the next meal, which might be many hours and several acres of cotton away. And once that context lands, the dish stops looking careless. What seemed like a kitchen without discipline reveals itself as a kitchen operating under a discipline far stricter than any European visitor has likely had to apply to their own breakfast. One measured not in flavor pairings but in calories per penny, in hours of labor a plate could sustain. The gravy that looked like a mistake was, for generations of southern farmers, the difference between finishing the day's work and not. But scarcity explains biscuits and gravy. It doesn't explain how, a century later, a dairy surplus on a California guest ranch would turn into the single most popular condiment in the entire country, sold not out of necessity, but out of pure commercial momentum. Ask a European to name an American condiment, and the answer that comes back most often isn't ketchup or mustard, it's ranch. A thick, pale, herb-flecked dressing that seems to appear on everything from salad to pizza to a plate of plain vegetables, as though it were less a sauce than a national reflex. For a visitor raised on vinaigrette, olive oil, or nothing at all on a salad, the sheer volume of ranch consumed in America can look almost comic. A country apparently unable to eat a vegetable without first burying it in buttermilk and dried herbs. The question isn't really what does it taste like, it's why does it need to be everywhere? The answer starts, unglamorously, with a plumber. In 1954, a man named Steve Henson took a job as a plumbing contractor in rural Alaska, where he began experimenting with a buttermilk and herb dressing to liven up the food served to fellow workers on remote job sites. When Henson and his wife later bought a dude ranch in Santa Barbara, California, a guest ranch called Hidden Valley Ranch, where vacationers came to ride horses and eat home-style meals, he served the same dressing at the table, and guests kept asking to take the recipe home with them. What began as a way to make ranch house cooking memorable for paying guests became almost by accident the ranch's actual export. Bottled dressing mix, sold first out of the ranch gift shop, then regionally, then nationally once Henson began licensing the dry seasoning packets to grocery chains in the 1970s. But a good recipe alone doesn't explain how ranch overtook an entire country's refrigerators within a generation. That required a second, much larger piece of infrastructure, the industrialization of the American dairy supply. Buttermilk, the tangy cultured liquid at the base of ranch dressing, had historically been a byproduct, a leftover from churning butter that dairies had limited use for. As American dairy processing scaled up through the mid-20th century, producers found themselves with buttermilk surpluses and a genuine commercial incentive to find products that could absorb them. Ranch dressing arrived at almost exactly the right moment, a shelf-stable, mass-producible product that could consume dairy surplus at industrial volume, manufactured in the same regional distribution networks, already built to move milk, cheese, and other perishables from processing plants to grocery shelves across the country within days. Ranch didn't have to build a supply chain. It inherited one that dairy cooperatives had already spent decades constructing for other products. That distribution advantage is what separated ranch from every other regional condiment that might have become popular but never spread. A barbecue sauce from Kansas City or a hot sauce from Louisiana had to fight for shelf space region by region, competing against dressings people already trusted. Ranch, riding the dairy industry's existing cold chain logistics, could reach a supermarket in Ohio and a supermarket in Oregon in the same week at the same price with the same taste. An advantage of infrastructure, not flavor. By the 1990s, market research firms were tracking it as the best-selling salad dressing in the United States, a position it has not meaningfully relinquished since, less because Americans decided collectively that herb buttermilk was the best possible topping for a vegetable, and more because no competitor could match the sheer physical reach that dairy logistics had handed it for free. This is the part that tends to reframe the dressing for a skeptical visitor. The ubiquity that looks like a lack of culinary imagination is underneath a story about supply chains, about a country whose dairy infrastructure was so efficient it could turn a plumber's improvised campsite recipe into a condiment sitting in nearly every refrigerator in the nation within 40 years. What looks like Americans smothering everything in the same sauce out of habit is closer to a fluid delivery network finding its most efficient possible cargo and never quite giving up the route. But ranch dressing spread because a supply chain was ready to carry it. What happens when the thing being spread nationwide isn't a condiment at all, but a holiday tradition? One manufactured almost entirely by an advertising department and then handed to families as though it had always existed. A particular silence falls over a European guest at Thanksgiving when the sweet potato casserole arrives. Not because it's unfamiliar, but because of what's on top. Beneath a browned crust sit dozens of half-melted marshmallows, turning a savory root vegetable into something closer to dessert. The polite question is usually whether this is a joke dish, smuggled onto the adult table and never removed. The real answer is stranger. It's an advertising campaign that never officially ended. Sweet potatoes need no explanation. They've anchored Southern and African American cooking for centuries. The marshmallow topping does, and it has a precise birth date. In 1917, the Angelus Marshmallow Company, trying to expand a product still associated mainly with campfires, published a recipe booklet demonstrating innovative marshmallow uses, including candied sweet potatoes baked under a melted marshmallow layer. This wasn't a home cook's discovery a company later capitalized on. It was manufactured demand, engineered in a corporate test kitchen to sell a product households had no habit of buying. Timing made the campaign work. Marshmallows had only just become mass-producible thanks to a new manufacturing process that could stamp them out cheaply by the thousands, leaving the company with capacity and no daily buying habit to sell into. Thanksgiving, already the largest home cooking event on the calendar and already built around sweet potatoes, was close to the perfect target. One meal, cooked in nearly every household on the same day every year. What made the campaign outlast every other advertisement of its era is that it didn't just sell a product, it embedded itself inside a ritual. A print ad gets forgotten within a week. A recipe repeated at the same table every November, passed from a mother's recipe box to a daughter's, has no expiration date. Within 2 generations, it's indistinguishable from tradition. By the time women's magazines were reprinting the marshmallow version as a standard side rather than a novelty, most families had no idea they were still following a 1917 sales brochure. The dish had stopped being an advertisement and simply become what Thanksgiving sweet potatoes look like. What tends to land hardest with a visitor mid-bite is this. A tradition, sincere enough to be fought over, every November began as a strategy to move surplus manufacturing capacity. Unlike biscuits and gravy or peanut butter, nothing about it was handed down from necessity. It was handed down from a marketing department, one that succeeded so completely the marketing disappeared, leaving only the ritual. And knowing this changes nothing about how it's eaten. Families who could recite this history exactly would still add the marshmallows next November, not because they've been fooled, but because somewhere between 1917 and now, the advertisement finished becoming a memory. But if a candy company could quietly rewrite a national holiday, what does it take for a segregated jazz club after midnight to invent a breakfast that outlived the clubs, the music, and the curfews that made it necessary? To a European eye, chicken and waffles looks like 2 separate meals collided by accident. Crisp fried chicken, syrup-drenched waffles, sharing a single plate as though breakfast and dinner had simply run out of time to happen separately. The instinct is to ask which course this actually belongs to. The honest answer is both, because it was invented for people who needed both at once, at an hour when neither was technically being served. The dish's clearest origin traces to Harlem in the 1930s, at jazz clubs like Wells Supper Club, where musicians finished sets well after midnight, too late for dinner service, too early for the diners to open for breakfast. Kitchens caught in that gap solved it by serving both meals fused into one: fried chicken, a dinner food, plated with waffles, a breakfast food, syrup included. It wasn't a flavor experiment, it was a scheduling problem solved on a plate for a workforce whose entire day ran several hours behind everyone else's. That inverted schedule wasn't incidental. It was the whole reason the dish needed to exist. Jazz musicians and club staff lived nocturnally by necessity performing when white-collar America slept and sleeping when it worked, which meant breakfast and dinner weren't fixed clock times for them so much as sequence. Whatever came after waking, whatever came before it. A dish that could function as either let a kitchen stay open for one crowd instead of two, at an hour when almost nothing else was. What tends to strike a visitor once they hear this is how literal the logic is. The sweetness of the syrup and the salt of the fried chicken weren't paired for contrast the way a modern chef might design a menu item. They were paired because one plate had to do the job of 2 meals for people whose day didn't line up with anyone else's clock. The confusion a first-time diner feels, unsure whether they're eating breakfast or dinner, is the same confusion the dish was built to resolve for the people who first ate it at 2 a.m. in Harlem, uncertain themselves which meal they were technically having. But if a jazz club's off hours could invent a breakfast, what does it take for a national emergency to invent a cheese? One engineered not to taste better, but to survive a war. Few foods draw more instant suspicion from a European visitor than the individually wrapped slice of American cheese. Perfectly square, unnervingly uniform, sliding out of its plastic sleeve without a single crumb out of place. It doesn't crumble like cheddar or stretch like mozzarella. It melts into a smooth, glossy sheet with no resistance at all. To eyes raised on cheese that varies slightly with every wheel, it doesn't look like food that came from milk. It looks manufactured, and that instinct, unlike most first impressions on this list, happens to be exactly right. American cheese was engineered, quite deliberately, by a Swiss immigrant named James L. Kraft, who patented a pasteurization process in 1916 that let cheese be melted down, blended, and resealed in a way that stopped it from spoiling or separating. A food that could sit unrefrigerated for weeks and survive shipment across distances that would ruin traditional cheese within days. The goal was never flavor complexity, it was shelf life, consistency, and durability. The same 3 properties that make a food valuable to an army rather than a dinner table. That distinction became decisive in the World Wars. Kraft's processed cheese was shipped by the millions of pounds to American soldiers overseas, packed into ration kits specifically because it could survive weeks in a supply truck without refrigeration, at a time when battlefield logistics, not taste, decided what soldiers ate. The military didn't request a better tasting cheese. It requested one that wouldn't spoil before it reached the front, and Kraft's factory-built product was one. 7 dishes, 7 different problems, a beetle destroying cotton fields, a temperance movement short on alternatives to whiskey, sharecroppers stretching a grocery bill to its absolute limit, a dairy surplus in need of a route to market, a marshmallow company with excess capacity, a jazz club running on the wrong side of the clock, an army that needed a cheese that wouldn't spoil before it reached the front. None of them were designed to taste strange, they were designed to work, and the strangeness was simply what was left over once the actual problem got solved. That's the part a first bite never reveals. A visitor tasting peanut butter or root beer or a square of processed cheese for the first time is really tasting a decision made decades earlier by someone who wasn't thinking about flavor at all. A pharmacist, a scientist, a farmer, a general. And the food survived, not because it was loved on contact, but because it did its job well enough to still be sitting on the table generations later. What looks like a country with peculiar taste may actually be a country that has simply kept more of its engineering than its explanations, so that only the result remains, stripped of the reason it was ever built that way. Which raises the harder question, the one that tends to follow a visitor home long after the plate is empty. If the strangest foods in a culture are usually the ones solving the oldest problems, what does it say about a dish that looks completely normal? The ones nobody questions in any country, because no one's ever had to ask what problem they were built to solve?